So, as mentioned, today I'm going to talk about COVID-19 as a threat to international peace and security, focusing on the response of the UN Security Council to the pandemic. So on the 1st of July, 111 days after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a global pandemic, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2532. Recognizing that the unprecedented extent of the novel coronavirus pandemic is likely to endanger the maintenance of international peace and security, the Security Council has demanded for the first time a general and immediate cessation of hostilities in all situations on its agenda, and supported the appeal of UN Secretary General António Guterres for a global ceasefire. In my presentation today, I will begin by briefly setting out the background and content of Security Council Resolution 2532. Then I'll discuss with you the legal nature of the measures called for in the resolution and the potential role of the Security Council in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. So as you're all aware, on the 11th of March, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a global pandemic. 12 days later, on the 23rd of March, the Secretary General called for a global ceasefire in order to focus efforts on fighting the pandemic and open humanitarian corridors to deliver aid to those most vulnerable. On the 2nd of April, the General Assembly added its voice by passing a resolution calling for intensified international cooperation to contain, mitigate, and defeat the pandemic. Noticeably silent throughout all of this was the UN Security Council. Tensions between the US and China in relation to the origins of the virus, the initial handling of the pandemic, and the deteriorating relationship between the US and the WHO led to disagreements between members on the Council about how to refer to the virus in the resolution, as well as whether or not to mention the WHO in the resolution itself. Largely through the efforts of France and Tunisia, a compromise was reached, and on the 1st of July 2020, the Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2532. There is no mention of the WHO in the resolution, but the solution was found by including in the preamble reference to the General Assembly resolution, which itself in its preamble refers to or acknowledges the crucial role played by the World Health Organization in the pandemic. In addition to the measures relating to international peace and security that I'll focus on in my presentation today, the resolution also requests action by the Secretary General to help ensure that all relevant parts of the UN system accelerate their response to the pandemic, including support by peacekeeping operations to host countries, and acknowledges the critical role played by women in response efforts. With respect to international peace and security, the resolution is remarkable for the following key provisions. First of all, it considers that the unprecedented extent of the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to endanger the maintenance of international peace and security. I'll come back to this and its implications a bit later in the presentation. Secondly, it demands a general and immediate cessation of hostilities in all situations on its agenda. And thirdly, it calls upon all parties to armed conflicts to engage immediately in a durable humanitarian pause for at least 90 consecutive days. The demand for a general and immediate cessation of hostilities applies to all situations currently on its agenda, which includes the situations that you see on the screen. The situation in the Middle East also includes the current conflicts taking place in Yemen and Syria. The call for a humanitarian pause applies to all parties to armed conflicts and is intended to enable the safe, unhindered, and sustained delivery of humanitarian assistance, provisions of related services by impartial humanitarian actors, and medical evacuations in accordance with international law. It's important to note that the demand for a ceasefire and the call for a humanitarian pause do not apply to military operations against the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and other designated terrorist groups. It therefore does not apply to military operations such as the conflict in Yemen against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, conflicts between the US-led coalition in Iraq and the Islamic State, and conflicts between various groups in Syria against Islamic State and Al-Qaeda affiliates. So turning now to the legal nature of the measures, given the potentially far-reaching effects of the resolution, what is its legal nature? And are the measures that it calls for legally binding? And what is their legal effect on non-state actors in particular? What has been the actual impact of the resolution so far? With respect to whether or not the measures are binding, there's no agreed upon legal basis for interpreting a Security Council resolution, but focusing on the wording of the UN Charter from which the Security Council derives its competences and powers, the question becomes whether the resolution or the measures that it calls for constitute a decision within the meaning of Article 25 of the UN Charter. And that's because under that article, members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council. So the resolution can be adopted under Chapter 6, which relates to the Pacific settlement of disputes, or under Chapter 7, which is action with respect to threats of the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. Usually, or not, though not always, resolutions adopted under Chapter 7 can be binding, whereas under Chapter 6, they're regarded as non-binding. No Security Council ceasefire resolution to date, as far as I know, has expressly invoked Chapter 6 because by their nature, ceasefires usually already endanger international peace and security. But as you can see from the wording of Article 34, the Security Council may determine whether a situation is likely to endanger the maintenance of international peace and security. And then under Article 36, it may recommend appropriate procedures with respect to that situation. So the words in Article 34 are the same words as appear in the preamble of the resolution that we're currently looking at, which seems to indicate that the measures set out in the resolution are adopted under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. As such, they would be considered to be non-binding since they're recommendations under Article 36 and not decisions within the meaning of Article 25 of the UN Charter. So this is at odds with the wording of the resolution itself because it demands a cessation of hostilities rather than recommending, calling for, or urging. So it's somewhat inconclusive, and it also depends on the method of interpretation that one applies. So we can discuss this later if you're interested. So my position would be that it seems to be non-binding, but of course, the Security Council could choose to take action to enforce compliance with the resolution under Chapter 7, which would make it binding in practical terms anyway. Regarding the legal effect on non-state actors, do ceasefire resolutions also bind non-state actors? So it's obviously a big topic in international law, the position of non-state actors and whether and how they are bound. This is discussed a lot in international humanitarian law, so one could apply those arguments by analogy to this case to argue whether or not non-state armed groups are also bound. But unlike the sources of IHL, which are treaty and custom, the Security Council resolution is neither, so it's not clear. Non-state actors are also not members of the United Nations, so there are similar challenges with respect to determining whether the Security Council may create obligations for non-members of the United Nations, and this is also discussed. In any case, the Security Council itself assumes that it can do so. In various resolutions, including with respect to the Ebola outbreak in the DRC, it called on all parties to non-international armed conflicts to cease hostilities. The International Court of Justice in the Kosovo advisory opinion also seemed to indicate its acceptance that the Security Council may create some obligations for non-state armed groups. Compliance and enforcement. The call by the Secretary General for a ceasefire has met with political endorsement by 180 UN member states so far and more than 20 armed movements. And it has had some impact on the ground, including unilateral cessation of hostilities in Sudan, the announcement of temporary ceasefires in various armed conflicts, a unilateral ceasefire in the Philippines for 1 month. However, in many of these cases, the violence has re-escalated since April. The impact of Security Council Resolution 2532 itself is so far unclear, given that the resolution was passed less than 2 weeks ago. So it remains to be seen what the added value of the resolution will be in practical terms. In any case, as I mentioned, there is still the possibility, although probably unlikely, of future sanctions being adopted to enforce compliance with the call for the ceasefire or the authorization of collective use of force under Chapter 7. So coming to the final part of my presentation, what is the potential role of the Security Council in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic? First of all, there are some precedents for the Security Council to address transnational health crises as threats to international peace and security, beginning with its response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in 2012 in Resolution 1983. So in that resolution, there was no mention of a threat to international peace and security, but the Council referred to its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. And it also noted the relationship between pandemic and conflict. The most pertinent precedent is in Resolution 2177 of 2014, in which the Council determined that the unprecedented extent of the Ebola outbreak in Africa constitutes a threat to international peace and security. And in 2018, in Resolution 2439, the Council adopted a further resolution with respect to the Ebola outbreak and called for the immediate cessation of hostilities by all armed groups in that region. So given these precedents, it's plausible that the COVID-19 pandemic may also constitute a threat to international peace and security, particularly given the very high numbers now of confirmed cases and more than 500,000 global deaths. Furthermore, it's been reported that the coronavirus pandemic has led to a deterioration of the humanitarian situation in conflict settings such as in Yemen. And it's also recognized as a conflict multiplier, which exacerbates indicators of violence such as unemployment, inequality, social stigma, and distrust in public institutions. The UN Secretary General also identified a number of risks to international peace and security generated by the pandemic, including the risk of escalation in violence in current conflict settings, exploitation of the situation by terrorists, and an increased risk of bioterrorist attacks. So what then could be the role for the Security Council in addressing the pandemic? In addition to ceasefires and humanitarian aid corridors that we see in the resolution that we've been discussing, there are other measures that the Security Council could potentially take to address the pandemic. One of them would be ensuring global access to vaccines and other medical technology that may be developed to fight the pandemic. The Council could also play a role in the global coordination of the pandemic response, particularly since its impacts and the required response are broader than health risks and also require global cooperation in a wider humanitarian response. These could include similar measures called for in Resolution 2177 of 2014 with respect to Ebola, in which the Council called for the lifting of travel and border restrictions, called on member states to facilitate delivery of assistance, including personnel and supplies, enhancing public information campaigns and combating misinformation, and interestingly, urging member states to implement relevant temporary recommendations issued under the international health regulations of the WHO. The Council also provides a high-level political forum for open exchange of views on the security implications of international health threats. For example, already on the 2nd of July, the Council held an open debate, which was viewable online, on the implications of COVID-19 for the maintenance of international peace and security, involving Council members, the UN Secretary General, the African Union, and the ICRC. So we can also discuss the broader implications of this expansion of the concept of international peace and security under the UN Charter. So it results in an expansion of the mandate of the Security Council under Article 24 of the UN Charter, and the potential expansion of collective security measures under Chapter 7. However, it also provides scope to address other global risks, such as the climate crisis. So Germany, in its current presidency of the UN Security Council, has already placed on the agenda of the Council addressing the climate crisis as a threat to international peace and security. So I would like to end on this statement by Heiko Maas, the German Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs, who stated that the Council must finally embrace a broader understanding of peace and security. Today, we know a virus can be more deadly than a gun. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.